The clinking of silverware against fine china was the only percussion in the hushed cathedral of Aurelia, a restaurant where wealth was the quietest, most confident guest. At the central table, a bubble of tense energy surrounded Julian Croft. His suit was a slash of brilliant white against the dark wood and crimson velvet of the dining room, a beacon of his own perceived purity and importance. He wasn't just dining, he was holding court. Across from him sat Mr. Sterling, a man whose portfolio was as old and heavy as a king's treasure, the final piece in a corporate acquisition Julian had pursued for months. Ilara moved between the tables with a practiced grace, her black uniform a shadow in the periphery of the glittering clientele. For 6 weeks she had been a ghost here, refilling water glasses, clearing plates, her presence so negligible that men like Julian Croft looked through her as if she were made of glass. It was the perfect vantage point. She saw the casual cruelty, the dismissive waves of a hand, the condescension baked into every polite request. She absorbed it all, filing it away in the cold, meticulous ledger of her mind. The moment she had been engineering for a lifetime was approaching. In her hand was a bottle of Chateau Margaux, a vintage that cost more than her monthly rent. Its deep red contents were the ink with which she would sign the end of Julian Croft's world. As she approached his table, she allowed a flicker of manufactured nervousness to touch her hands. Her steps faltered, just for a fraction of a second, a micro-stumble so believable it would have convinced a master thespian. The bottle tilted. A perfect crimson arc of wine sailed through the air, landing not on the pristine tablecloth, but directly on the lapel of Julian Croft's immaculate white suit. The stain blossomed like a grotesque flower, a splash of violence on a canvas of pure arrogance. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. All conversation ceased. Mr. Sterling's eyebrows shot up into his silver hairline. Julian Croft looked down at his ruined suit, his face a slow, terrifying crawl from disbelief to incandescent rage. His eyes, the color of cold steel, lifted from the stain and locked onto Ilara. "You clumsy, incompetent fool," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. The words were like stones dropped into a silent pool. "My sincerest apologies, sir. It was an accident," Ilara said, her voice steady, betraying none of the triumphant thunder in her heart. "An accident?" Julian's voice rose, cracking the reverent quiet of the restaurant. "An accident with a $2,000 bottle of wine on a $10,000 suit. Do you have any idea who I am?" He stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the polished floor. He was a tall man, used to using his height to intimidate. He loomed over her, his shadow swallowing her whole. The restaurant manager, a perpetually anxious man named Dubois, began scurrying towards them, wringing his hands. "I know exactly who you are, Mr. Croft," Ilara said, her voice still unnervingly calm. Her calmness seemed to infuriate him more than any apology could. It was a denial of his power, a refusal to cower. His face twisted into a mask of pure contempt. He saw not a person, but an obstacle, a worthless subordinate who had dared to mar his perfect evening. And in a flash of unrestrained entitlement, he did what he always did when the world did not bend to his will. He acted. His hand came up, fast and hard. The sound of his palm connecting with her cheek was a gunshot in the silent room. It was sharp, ugly, and absolute. Ilara's head snapped to the side from the force of the blow. A red handprint began to bloom on her skin, a mirror to the wine stain on his suit. The silence that followed was heavier, more profound. It was the silence of shock, of a line so flagrantly crossed that no one knew how to react. Mr. Dubois froze mid-stride. Mr. Sterling stared, his mouth slightly agape. Julian Croft lowered his hand, a smug, satisfied look on his face. He had restored order. He had put the help back in her place. He expected tears, a terrified apology, a pathetic retreat. He got none of it. Ilara slowly turned her head back to face him. There were no tears in her eyes. There was no fear. There was only a fire, an ancient, patient inferno that had been banked for decades, now roaring to life. A slow, chilling smile touched her lips. She didn't even touch her stinging cheek. Her gaze was locked on his, and for the first time, Julian Croft felt a sliver of something other than power. It felt like cold dread. Without breaking eye contact, she reached over to the silver ice bucket on his table. Her fingers wrapped around the neck of a bottle of Dom Pérignon. Beads of condensation cold against her skin. She lifted it. It was heavy, solid, a weapon in waiting. "You should not have done that," she said, her voice no longer calm, but resonating with a deep, chilling power that seemed to come from the very floorboards. Before he could process the shift, before he could utter another insult or call for security, she swung the bottle. It moved in a swift, clean arc, not a wild swing of passion, but a precise, deliberate strike. The heavy green glass connected with the side of his head with a sickening, percussive thud that echoed through the dining room. Julian Croft's eyes went wide with shock, the smugness evaporating into pure, unadulterated pain. He staggered back, a hand flying to his head, his legs buckling beneath him. He crumpled to the floor, landing in a heap of stained white silk and broken pride, a thin trickle of blood beginning to weave through his perfectly coiffed hair. The room erupted into chaos. Patrons screamed. Mr. Dubois finally found his voice, shouting for security. But Ilara stood over Julian's fallen form, the champagne bottle still in her hand, its gold foil glinting under the chandeliers. She looked down at the man who represented the pinnacle of everything she had sworn to destroy. She leaned down, her voice a whisper meant only for him, a pronouncement that cut through his pain-filled haze. "This is for the Vances," she whispered, a name that meant nothing to him, but everything to her. Then she straightened up, her voice ringing out clear and strong for all to hear, a declaration of war disguised as a statement of fact. "Don't worry about the damages," she said, her gaze sweeping over the shocked faces of the diners. "Put it on my tab." She then looked back down at the groaning man on the floor, her final words delivered with the cold finality of a judge's sentence. "And as for you, Julian," she said, the chilling smile returning to her face, "you made a mistake. You slapped a waitress. But I own your soul." The aftermath was a symphony of predictable chaos. Two burly security guards, their faces grim, descended on Ilara. Mr. Dubois, his face pale and beaded with sweat, flapped around them like a panicked bird. Julian Croft was being helped to his feet by a concerned Mr. Sterling, dabbing at the cut on his temple with a linen napkin, his expression a mixture of fury and dizzy confusion. "She's insane, a maniac," Julian bellowed, his voice unsteady. "I want her arrested. I want her sued into the Stone Age. She'll be eating out of dumpsters for the rest of her miserable life." Ilara offered no resistance as the guards took her arms. She remained a pillar of calm in the storm she had created. She dropped the champagne bottle, which rolled to a stop near Julian's expensive leather shoes. She met the furious glare of the manager, Mr. Dubois, with an unnerving placidity. "You are fired. Do you hear me? Fired," he screeched, his voice cracking, "and you will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Assault, with a weapon." "Of course," Ilara said simply, as if he were discussing the weather. She was escorted through the now buzzing restaurant, past the gawking faces of the 1%. They saw a disgraced waitress being hauled away, a cautionary tale about what happens when the lower class gets out of line. They didn't see the architect of a corporate demolition walking calmly from the blast site. They took her not to a police car, but to a small windowless security office in the basement of the building. The protocol was to hold her until the police arrived to get her statement to ensure the restaurant's liability was minimized. One guard stood by the door while the other began the process of formally logging the incident. "Name?" the guard asked, not looking at her, his pen poised over a clipboard. "Ilara Vance," she said. The name, as she knew it would, meant nothing to him. To the world, she was a nobody, a ghost. That was the way it had been for 28 years. That was the way it had to be. As the guard droned on with his questions, Ilara's mind was not in the stuffy little room. It was back in the grand dining room, replaying the moment of impact. The satisfying thud of the bottle, the look of pure shock on Julian's face. It wasn't just revenge for a slap. It was the first tremor of an earthquake she had spent her life planning. The slap was merely the pretext, the public catalyst she needed. He had handed her the moral high ground on a silver platter, turning her calculated act of aggression into a perceived act of self-defense in the eyes of the public narrative she was about to shape. An hour passed. The guard's walkie-talkie crackled intermittently. Julian Croft had been taken to a private clinic to have his head wound stitched up. He had, of course, pressed charges. The police were on their way. Ilara sat perfectly still, a portrait of patience. She knew the sequence of events that was about to unfold. She had rehearsed it in her mind 1,000 times. The system was designed to protect men like Julian. The police would arrive, take his statement, see his wealth and his wound, and then see her, a lowly waitress with a now blooming bruise on her cheek. They would arrest her. She would spend a night in jail. It was all part of the cost. A small price to pay for a front-row seat to the implosion of an empire. Finally, the door opened. But it wasn't the police. It was a man in a suit far more expensive than Mr. Dubois. He was tall, with sharp features and hair the color of salt and pepper. He carried a sleek leather briefcase. His eyes, intelligent and focused, immediately found Ilara. He nodded once, a subtle gesture of acknowledgement. He turned to the guards. "I am Marcus Thorne," he said, his voice smooth and authoritative. "I'm Ms. Vance's legal counsel. I'll be taking over from here." The guards exchanged a confused look. A waitress in a standard-issue uniform had a high-powered attorney on standby, one who looked like he billed $1,000 an hour just to breathe. "We have to wait for the police, sir," the first guard said, puffing out his chest slightly. "Mr. Croft is pressing charges." Marcus Thorne allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I assure you," he said, opening his briefcase, "that will no longer be necessary." He produced a tablet and swiped the screen, turning it to face the guards. Displayed on it was a news alert, time-stamped just 15 minutes prior. Breaking news: Croft Industries CEO Julian Croft under investigation for massive fraud. Assets frozen pending inquiry. The guards stared at the screen, their mouths hanging open. Marcus then swiped to another screen. It was a formal legal notice, a withdrawal of charges, signed electronically by a representative of the district attorney's office. "It seems Mr. Croft has far more significant problems than a headache," Marcus said coolly. "A mountain of evidence of embezzlement, insider trading, and market manipulation was anonymously delivered to the SEC and the DA's office about 90 minutes ago. His corporate assets, his personal accounts, everything has been frozen by federal order. He can't even pay for his own stitches right now, let alone a team of lawyers to prosecute a waitress." He looked at Ilara. "Are you ready to leave, Ms. Vance?" Ilara stood up, smoothing down her simple black uniform. She walked past the stunned guards without a word and followed Marcus Thorne out of the security office and towards a private exit. She had not spent a single night in jail. Phase 2 had begun precisely on schedule. As they stepped out into the cool night air, a black town car pulled up to the curb. Marcus opened the door for her. "Everything is in motion," he said quietly as she slid into the plush leather seat. "The markets will be in chaos by morning. The board is in a panic." "And Julian?" she asked, her voice betraying a hint of emotion for the first time. "His credit cards were declined at the clinic," Marcus replied, a flicker of grim satisfaction in his eyes. "He was forced to call his father, who is currently on a golf course in Dubai, screaming at him for an explanation. He has no idea what's happening. He just knows his entire world has been turned off like a light switch." Ilara leaned her head back against the seat, the city lights blurring past the window. The bruise on her cheek throbbed, a dull physical reminder of the contact. It was the only unplanned part of the evening, but it had been the most perfect part. It had given her the justification she needed. "Good," she said, a single sharp word. "Let him be confused. Let him be afraid. He's about to learn what it feels like to have everything you've ever known ripped away from you by a force you can't see and don't understand." She was no longer Ilara Vance, the waitress. That persona had been shed the moment she walked out of Aurelia's doors. Now she was simply Vance, the inheritor of a generations-old promise, the ghost who had finally come to collect a debt of honor, paid in ruin. The soul of the Croft dynasty was hers for the taking. Julian Croft's penthouse apartment was a monument to excess, a glass-walled palace in the sky that looked down on the city like a god from his own private Olympus. But that night it felt like a cage. He paced the vast marble floor, a bloody bandage crudely taped to his temple, his ruined suit jacket slung over a ridiculously expensive sculpture. His phone was practically glued to his ear, his voice a raw, ragged shout. "What do you mean? You can't get through to them? You're the CFO, Robert. Make them answer," he roared. On the other end of the line, Robert Davies, a man who had managed the Croft family's finances for 2 decades, sounded like he was on the verge of a heart attack. "Julian, you don't understand," Robert stammered, his voice thin with panic. "It's not that they won't answer. The accounts they're gone, not empty, frozen, locked down by a federal warrant, all of them. The corporate accounts, the offshore holdings, your personal trust. It's a complete asset seizure." "On what grounds? This is impossible. It's a mistake," Julian yelled, slamming his free hand down on a glass table. "They're citing evidence of long-term systemic fraud, embezzlement schemes going back years, market manipulation on the Sterling deal." "The Sterling deal?" Julian's blood ran cold. He thought of Mr. Sterling's shocked face at the restaurant. This couldn't be a coincidence. "That's a lie. It's the cleanest deal we've ever put together." "The evidence says otherwise, Julian, and it's incredibly detailed. Trading logs, encrypted emails, offshore transfer records. It's a kill shot. Someone handed the government a loaded gun and pointed it right at our heads." Julian's mind raced, trying to find purchase in the swirling vortex of disaster. Who could have done this? A rival? A disgruntled board member? He had enemies, of course. Men like him always did. But this was different. This was surgical. It was an attack from within, executed with a level of precision that was terrifying. Then a flicker of a memory. A calm, steady voice in the chaos of the restaurant. "I own your soul." He shook his head, dismissing it. The waitress. A nobody. A violent lunatic. It was absurd. She was a symptom of his bad night, not the cause. The cause was a corporate betrayal of the highest order. "Find out who did this, Robert," Julian snarled, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I don't care what it costs. I want a name. I want to know who is responsible for this." "I'll try," Robert said, though he sounded utterly defeated. "But Julian, the lawyers are already dropping us. No one wants to touch this. They're saying the evidence is ironclad." The line went dead. Julian threw his phone across the room. It shattered against a floor-to-ceiling window, the web of cracks marring the perfect view of the glittering city below. A city that had, until a few hours ago, been his kingdom. He sank into a leather armchair, his head throbbing. The physical pain was nothing compared to the gnawing, terrifying feeling of powerlessness. He had always been in control. His name, his money, it was a shield and a sword. It could open any door and solve any problem. But now it was gone. He was Julian Croft, but the name was suddenly weightless, meaningless. He thought again of the waitress, Ilara Vance. The name echoed in his mind. He had never noticed her before that night. She was part of the scenery, the faceless army that existed to serve him. Yet he couldn't shake the image of her eyes after he had struck her. They weren't the eyes of a terrified servant. They were the eyes of a predator that had just cornered its prey. The chilling confidence in her voice as she uttered those final words. "I own your soul." It was a preposterous, insane statement, and yet, as he sat in his silent, gilded cage, with his empire crumbling around him, and his name turning to ash in the mouths of news anchors, a sliver of impossible, terrifying doubt began to creep into his heart. What if she wasn't just a waitress? What if the slap, the wine, the chaos? What if it was all a distraction? A piece of theatre designed to put him off balance just as the real attack began? No, it was crazy. He was just shaken, hurt, and lashing out at the most immediate target. His personal assistant, a young, ambitious man named Carter, burst into the room, his face ashen. "Mr. Croft," he said, breathless, "there's an emergency board meeting. It's been called for 9 a.m. tomorrow. It's mandatory." "A board meeting?" Julian scoffed, a flicker of his old arrogance returning. "They can't call a meeting without me." "They did, sir," Carter said, swallowing hard. "It was called by a majority shareholder. A holding company we've never heard of. VE Global." Julian stared at him. VE Global, The initials meant nothing, just another faceless corporate entity. But then Carter delivered the final devastating blow. "Sir, the company is registered to a single proprietor. The name on the filing is Ilara Vance." The world tilted on its axis. The air in the penthouse suddenly felt thin, unbreathable. The name, which he had dismissed as the ravings of a madwoman, was now attached to the instrument of his destruction. VE Global. Vance Enterprises. It was her, the waitress, the ghost who had served him his wine just before she destroyed his life. The chilling words she had whispered to him in the restaurant came rushing back, no longer a mystery, but a horrifying statement of intent. "This is for the Vances." The name still meant nothing to him, but he knew, with a certainty that froze the blood in his veins, that he was about to find out exactly what it meant. The soul she claimed to own wasn't some metaphysical prize, it was his company, his legacy, his entire world, and she had just signed the deed. The story of the Vances was not written in history books or corporate archives. It was a ghost story, passed down through 3 generations, a tale of betrayal whispered in quiet rooms, fueled by shame and a burning, unquenchable thirst for justice. Ilara had grown up with it. It was her dark, twisted bedtime story. It began with her great-grandfather, Arthur Vance. He was a brilliant inventor, a visionary in the early days of industrial manufacturing. He had developed a revolutionary new process for refining steel, one that was stronger, lighter, and cheaper than anything that existed. He poured his life, his savings, and his soul into his small company, Vance Steel. His partner, his trusted friend, was a charismatic and ruthless businessman named Alistair Croft, Julian's grandfather. Arthur was the genius, Alistair was the salesman. Together they were poised to change the world. But Alistair saw a quicker path to singular glory. On the eve of filing their joint patents, Alistair drugged Arthur's drink, stole the final schematics, and filed every single patent under his own name. He locked Arthur out of his own factory, used his network to smear Arthur's name, and painted him as a fraud and a madman. Arthur Vance, robbed of his life's work and his reputation, fought back. He spent every last penny on lawyers, but Alistair Croft, with the full resources of the newly formed Croft Industries behind him, buried him in litigation. The court sided with the man who had the paperwork and the power. Arthur lost everything. He died a broken man, his name a footnote of failure, his genius credited to the thief who had stolen his future. The Vance family fell from prosperity into poverty. Ilara's grandfather worked his fingers to the bone in a factory that should have been his. Her father, a quiet, brilliant man who inherited Arthur's mind, but not his ambition, became a high school physics teacher, forever haunted by the shadow of what their family had lost. He would show Ilara his great-grandfather's old notebooks, filled with elegant equations and drawings, the proof of their stolen legacy. "He didn't just steal a patent, Ilara," her father would say, his voice thick with a sorrow so old it felt like a part of their DNA. "He stole our name. He stole our future. He built an empire on a lie, and we were left with the truth, which, it turns out, is worthless in this world." But Ilara did not see it that way. She saw the truth not as a weakness, but as a weapon in waiting. She inherited Arthur's genius, but she also possessed a trait he lacked, a core of pure, unyielding steel. From a young age, she devoured books not on physics, but on economics, on corporate law, on financial warfare. She understood that the Crofts' empire was built on money and power. To defeat them, she had to speak their language. She excelled, earning scholarships to the best universities, her brilliance masked by a quiet, unassuming demeanor. No one knew the fire that drove her. While her peers were chasing internships at investment banks, Ilara was studying the history of hostile takeovers. She learned how to use debt as a weapon, how to hide ownership in a labyrinth of shell corporations, how to find the cracks in a company's foundation. Her entire life became a singular mission. She took on high-paying, anonymous consulting jobs in finance, living a Spartan life and pouring every dollar she earned into her plan. She started small, buying up tiny, insignificant shares of Croft Industries through obscure holding companies. She studied their quarterly reports, their market strategies, their vulnerabilities. Her big break came when she discovered the rot at the heart of the empire. Alistair Croft's ruthlessness had been passed down to his son and then to his grandson, Julian. But his genius had not. Julian was arrogant and careless. He ran the company like his personal piggy bank, engaging in risky, often illegal financial maneuvers to inflate profits and fund his extravagant lifestyle. He was leaving a trail of digital breadcrumbs, and Ilara was there to gather every single one. She created VE Global, a name that would have meant everything to her father, and began the real attack. She didn't buy their stock, she bought their debt. She found the banks and financial institutions that held the loans for Croft Industries' major expansion projects. Quietly, through intermediaries, she purchased that debt, becoming their silent, invisible creditor. Then she used her network of shell companies to orchestrate a short and distort campaign, anonymously leaking just enough negative information to drive the stock price down, allowing her other companies to buy up shares at a fraction of their value. It was a masterful 20-year game of chess, played in the shadows. The final piece was personal. She needed to be there to see it. She needed to look Julian Croft in the eye when his world came crashing down. And so, Ilara Vance, the financial mastermind who controlled a multi-billion-dollar web of assets, put on a simple black dress and became a waitress at Aurelia, the restaurant where Julian Croft celebrated his victories. She had served him for 6 weeks, watching, waiting for the perfect moment. The sterling deal was it. She knew from the evidence she had compiled that Julian had used illegal insider information to structure the acquisition. The moment that deal was announced, he would be at his most arrogant, his most triumphant. The wine spill was the spark, the slap was the gift she hadn't anticipated. It was a beautiful, ugly, perfect accelerant. It allowed her to seize the narrative. Now, sitting in the back of the town car with Marcus Thorne, her trusted legal counsel and the only other person who knew the full extent of her plan, she felt the weight of 3 generations settling on her shoulders. The evidence packet was delivered to the SEC, the IRS, and the Southern District of New York an hour before the incident at the restaurant. Marcus confirmed, reviewing notes on his tablet. The federal warrants were issued within minutes. By the time you smashed that bottle, his empire was already technically in receivership. He just didn't know it yet. He knows now, Ilara said, her hand unconsciously rising to her bruised cheek. It didn't hurt anymore. It felt like a medal. The board meeting is at 9, Marcus continued. They'll be in chaos. They think VE Global is just another corporate raider trying to pick at the company's bones now that it's vulnerable. They have no idea the butcher is already inside the slaughterhouse, Ilara murmured. She looked at her reflection in the dark window. For a moment, she didn't see herself. She saw her father's tired eyes, her grandfather's calloused hands, her great-grandfather's stolen dreams. Tomorrow, she said to Marcus, her voice hard as the steel her family should have owned, I am taking back our name. The Croft Industries boardroom was a theater of panic. Sunlight streamed through the panoramic windows on the 80th floor, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and the beads of sweat on the foreheads of the dozen board members gathered around the long obsidian table. They were sharks, titans of industry, men and women who carved up the world for a living, but that morning they were frightened fish in a tank that was rapidly draining. Their phones had been ringing off the hook all night with calls from bankers, lawyers, and terrified investors. The news of the federal investigation and asset freeze had hit the market like a meteor, and Croft Industries stock was in freefall. They spoke in hushed, frantic tones, speculating on the identity of VE Global, the mysterious majority shareholder that had called this emergency meeting. The consensus was that it was a vulture fund, a predator that had somehow sniffed out Julian's malfeasance and was positioning itself to buy up the company for pennies on the dollar after the government was done with it. The doors to the boardroom swung open and Julian Croft stormed in. He looked terrible. His face was pale and drawn, a purple bruise stark against his skin, and a small white bandage was plastered to his temple. His eyes were wild, darting around the room, a cornered animal looking for a threat. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice hoarse. "Who called this meeting?" Before anyone could answer, the doors opened again. This time, the entrance was silent, deliberate. Marcus Thorne walked in first, his presence immediately commanding a level of respect the panicked board members could only envy. He stepped to the side, and then she entered. Ilara Vance. A wave of confusion rippled through the room. A few of the board members who frequented Aurelia recognized her. She was the waitress, the one from the news reports that were already circulating online about the violent assault on Julian Croft. She was wearing not a waitress's uniform, but a charcoal grey power suit, impeccably tailored, that spoke of quiet, formidable wealth. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, elegant chignon, and the bruise on her cheek, far from making her look like a victim, seemed like a warrior's mark. Julian stared at her, his mouth falling open. "You," he breathed, a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror in his voice. "What are you doing here? Security, get her out of here." No one moved. They were all looking at Marcus Thorne, who calmly placed his briefcase on the table and opened it. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," Marcus began, his voice cutting through the tension, "allow me to introduce you to Ilara Vance, the sole proprietor of VE Global, and as of 8:45 this morning, the controlling stakeholder of Croft Industries." The statement landed with the force of a physical blow. A stunned, absolute silence fell over the room. The board members looked from Ilara to Marcus to Julian, their faces a canvas of shock. This was impossible. It was a joke. "That's a lie," Julian sputtered, finding his voice. "She's a nobody, a waitress who assaulted me." "She was an employee conducting first-hand market research," Ilara said, her voice calm and clear, resonating with an authority that belied her previous station. It was the first time she had spoken. She walked slowly towards the head of the table to the large leather chair that had always been Julian's. She didn't sit. She stood behind it, placing her hands on its back. Marcus began distributing folders to the stunned board members. "Inside, you will find documentation verifying Ms. Vance's position," he said. "VE Global, through a consortium of 37 different holding companies, has acquired 53% of the voting stock in this company over the past 18 months. Furthermore," he paused for effect, "VE Global is also the primary holder of this company's consolidated debt, which it purchased from its creditors over the last 5 years. To put it in simple terms, Ms. Vance owns your stock, and she owns your loans. She owns this company, lock, stock, and barrel." Julian snatched a folder, his hands trembling as he flipped through the pages. It was all there. Share certificates, debt instruments, legal filings. A complex, undeniable web of financial ownership that all led back to one name, Ilara Vance. His head snapped up, his eyes locking on hers. "How?" he whispered, the single word full of 1,000 questions. How could a waitress do this? Where did she get the money? Why? "You're wondering how," Ilara said, as if reading his mind. She let her gaze travel across the faces of the board, men and women who had enabled Julian's corruption for years, profiting from it while looking the other way. "You see a waitress. But my name isn't Waitress, it's Vance." She looked directly at Julian. "Does the name Arthur Vance mean anything to you, Julian? Or Alistair Croft? Your grandfather?" Julian's face was blank. It was ancient history, a name lost to the corporate mythology of the company's founding. "I didn't think so," Ilara said, a cold, bitter smile on her lips. "Your grandfather, Alistair, built this company by destroying my great-grandfather, Arthur. He stole his patents, his livelihood, and his name. He built this glass tower on a foundation of lies and theft. For 3 generations, my family has lived in the shadow of that crime. We lived with the truth, while you lived with the wealth." She finally sat down in the chairman's seat, the leather sighing under her weight. It felt like coming home. "I have spent my entire life working towards this day. Every dollar I ever made, every waking moment of my life, has been dedicated to one single purpose: to reclaim what was stolen from my family. I didn't want to destroy Croft Industries. I wanted to take it back. And the evidence of fraud, the crimes that have the federal government freezing your assets." She gave a small, humorless laugh. "That was just you, Julian. Your greed, your carelessness. You handed me the keys to your own prison. All I did was turn the lock." She looked around the table. "As the new majority owner, my first act is to dissolve this board, effective immediately. Your services are no longer required." My second act is to fully cooperate with the federal investigation into the financial crimes of the Croft administration. She stood up again, her authority now absolute and undeniable. And my third act, she said, her eyes finding Julian's again, is to terminate the employment of Julian Croft. She walked around the table until she stood directly in front of him. The entire room held its breath. He was a broken man, stripped of his power, his company, and his identity in the space of 10 minutes. "Last night you asked me if I knew who you were," she said, her voice low, "and I told you I did. Now I'm asking you, do you know who I am?" Julian could only stare, his face a mask of utter devastation. "I am the bill for your family's sins come due," she said softly. "I am the ghost of the man your grandfather destroyed, and as I told you last night," she leaned in closer, her voice a final damning whisper, "I own your soul." The boardroom cleared out in a state of shell-shocked silence. The deposed board members, once masters of the universe, shuffled out like ghosts, clutching their now meaningless folders, their minds struggling to process the sheer totality of their defeat. Marcus Thorne remained, quietly packing his briefcase, a silent guardian overseeing the transfer of power. The only two left were the victor and the vanquished, Ilara and Julian. Julian hadn't moved. He was still standing in the same spot, his body rigid, his eyes fixed on the empty space where his life used to be. The fight had drained out of him, replaced by a hollow, cavernous emptiness. "Everything," he finally said, his voice a dry rasp. "You took everything." "Everything your family stole," Ilara corrected him, her voice devoid of triumph. This wasn't a celebration. It was a reckoning. The company, the technology it was founded on, the wealth it generated, it's all just returning to its rightful owner. Think of it as the largest back payment in corporate history. He finally turned to look at her, and for the first time she saw not the arrogant bully from the restaurant, but a lost, bewildered man. The layers of entitlement and privilege had been stripped away, leaving something raw and pathetic in their place. "My father. My grandfather. I didn't know," he stammered. "I swear I never heard the name Vance. It was never mentioned." "Of course it wasn't," Ilara said, her voice cutting. "Thieves don't brag about their crimes to their children. They call it business acumen and strong negotiation. They build monuments to their success and bury the truth in the foundations. But the truth doesn't stay buried forever, Julian. Sometimes it grows into a tree and tears the whole house down." He sank into one of the chairs, his head in his hands. "What do you want from me? You have the company, you've ruined me. Isn't that enough?" "Enough." The word hung in the air, sharp and cold. Ilara walked to the vast windows, looking down at the city below. "Let me tell you what enough looks like, Julian. My great-grandfather died penniless and heartbroken, his name synonymous with failure. My grandfather spent 40 years working in a steel mill, breathing in toxic fumes, his body breaking down day by day, just to provide for his family. My father was a brilliant man who was too afraid to ever dream big, because he was taught that the world crushes people like us. I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment where the heating was unreliable and my parents argued about bills." She turned back to face him, her eyes burning with an intensity that made him flinch. "You want to know what I want? I want you to feel, just for a day, the powerlessness that has been my family's inheritance for almost a century. I want you to wake up in a world where your name means nothing, where your money is gone, where every door is closed to you. I want you to understand what it feels like to be on the other side of the slap." She gestured to Marcus, who approached and placed a single thin folder on the table in front of Julian. "That is what's left for you," Ilara explained. "I've established a trust. It's not much. It will pay for a small 1-bedroom apartment in a modest neighborhood. It will provide a monthly stipend that is exactly equivalent to the salary of a first-year high school teacher. It's enough to live on, but not enough to be powerful. You will never own a penthouse again. You will never fly private. You will never dine at Aurelia. The cars, the watches, the art, the properties, all of it is being liquidated to pay the company's debts and the fines you've incurred with the government." Julian looked at the folder as if it were a poisonous snake. "This is a life sentence," he whispered. "No," Ilara said, "it's a life. The kind of life that millions of people live every day. The kind of life my family lived. You're just not used to it. He looked up at her, a desperate final plea in his eyes. Please, don't do this. Ilara looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. She thought of the bruise on her cheek, the generations of quiet suffering, the notebooks filled with stolen genius. Her heart, for a moment, felt a flicker of something, but it wasn't pity. It was finality. The debt was paid, the ledger was balanced. The arrangements are non-negotiable, she said, her voice firm. Your personal effects will be delivered to your new address by the end of the week. You have until then to vacate the penthouse. She turned and walked towards the door, Marcus following her. She didn't look back. Wait, Julian called out, his voice cracking. What will you do? With the company? Ilara paused at the doorway, her back still to him. First, she said, I'm changing the name. It will no longer be Croft Industries. She finally turned her head slightly, offering him a last parting glance. It will be Vance Enterprises. And under my leadership, it will be a company built on integrity and innovation, not theft and lies. It will be the company it was always supposed to be. She walked out, leaving Julian Croft alone in the cavernous boardroom, a king in a fallen kingdom with nothing left but the echo of a name he had never bothered to learn, and the crushing weight of a soul he had just discovered was never his to begin with. 6 months passed, the seasons changed, and the city, in its relentless way, moved on. The financial world had been rocked by the fall of Croft Industries and the meteoric rise of the newly rebranded Vance Enterprises. But scandals, like storms, eventually pass, leaving a new landscape in their wake. The landscape for Julian Croft was bleak and unfamiliar. He lived in a small, drab apartment in a part of the city he had previously only flown over. The walls were thin, the view was of a brick wall, and the constant noise of traffic was a far cry from the serene silence of his former penthouse. The stipend Ilara had provided was, as she promised, just enough. Enough for rent, for groceries, for the subway. It was not enough for pride. He had tried to find work, but his name was now poison. The scandal was too public. His downfall too spectacular. No one in the financial world would touch him. He was a pariah. After weeks of rejections, he had found a job, stocking shelves on the night shift at a high-end grocery store. It was humbling, anonymous work. He would stack bottles of the same expensive wine he used to order by the case, his hands touching the labels of a life that was no longer his. He was thinner now, the arrogance stripped from his posture, replaced by a weary resignation. He was a ghost haunting the aisles of his former life. One evening, as he was leaving work, the sun just beginning to rise, he saw a familiar black town car stopped at a traffic light. In the back seat, he saw her. Ilara Vance. She was on the phone, looking at a tablet, the very picture of a modern CEO. She didn't see him. To her, he was just another shadow on the street, part of the scenery. The light changed, and the car sped away, leaving him standing on the corner in his cheap coat, the scent of its exhaust a final faint reminder of the power he once wielded. He didn't feel anger anymore, just a profound, hollow emptiness. Ilara, for her part, was not looking back. She was relentlessly focused on the future. Vance Enterprises was thriving under her leadership. She had purged the corrupt elements of the old guard, promoted talent from within, and invested heavily in research and development, unearthing and funding projects that the Crofts had ignored in their pursuit of easy profits. She was known as a demanding but fair leader, one who valued innovation over empty prestige. She was rebuilding the company from the foundation up, this time with integrity as the cornerstone. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, she drove out of the city to a small, well-tended cemetery. She found the modest headstone she was looking for. Arthur Vance, beloved husband and father, a brilliant mind at rest. She knelt and placed a small bouquet of simple, elegant white flowers at its base. Then, from her briefcase, she took out a single bound document. It was the new corporate charter for Vance Enterprises. She laid it gently on the grass next to the flowers. "I did it, great-grandfather," she whispered to the silent stone. "I took it back. I took it all back. Your name is on the front of the building now, where it always should have been." A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak tree that shaded the plot. For a moment, Ilara closed her eyes, feeling the sun on her face. The fire of vengeance that had fueled her for so long had cooled, leaving not emptiness, but a quiet, profound sense of peace. The debt was paid. The story was not over, but a new chapter, one of honor and legacy, had finally begun. She had not just reclaimed a company, she had reclaimed her family's soul from the ghost of a long-forgotten crime. And in doing so, she had finally found her own,